The ballroom was already over capacity 30 minutes before the event was supposed to begin. More than 3,000 people had filled the convention center. Security had stopped letting people through the front entrance. The overflow crowd stood along the walls. Some stood on chairs, others stood on tables. Nobody wanted to miss the appearance. The posters outside advertised an evening with two of the biggest action stars in the world, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Dolph Lundgren, two men who had built careers convincing audiences they could defeat almost anyone alive. The audience had come expecting stories, autographs, photographs, memories from movie sets. Nobody had come expecting a challenge, and certainly nobody expected one legend to call out the other. At 7:15, the house lights dimmed. The crowd erupted. Thousands of people rose to their feet. Camera flashes lit up the room. The announcer walked onto the stage. His voice echoed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, realization. The cheering became louder. Please welcome Jean-Claude Van Damme. The reaction was immediate. People stood, whistled, shouted. Some began chanting his name. Van Damme appeared from behind the curtain, smiling, relaxed, comfortable. He moved the way he always moved, loose, confident, as though every room belonged to him the moment he entered it. He waved, pointed at fans, shook hands near the stage. The crowd loved him, and for good reason. By that point, Van Damme had become something larger than a martial artist. He was a symbol. A generation had grown up watching him perform impossible kicks, impossible splits, impossible comebacks. The audience knew every movie, every fight scene, every knockout. To them, he wasn't just an actor. He was Jean-Claude Van Damme. Then the announcer spoke again. And now, the cheering started before the name was finished. Dolph Lundgren. The reaction was different. Still loud, still enthusiastic, but different. Van Damme inspired excitement. Dolph inspired curiosity, because Dolph looked different from almost every action star Hollywood had ever produced. He stood 6'5", broad shoulders, long reach, the kind of size that made people instinctively move out of the way. He looked less like an actor and more like a man who had accidentally wandered into Hollywood from somewhere much more dangerous. He stepped onto the stage. The audience applauded. Dolph nodded once. Nothing more. Then he took his seat. For the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded exactly as planned. Questions, answers, movie stories, training stories. Fans laughed. The atmosphere was relaxed. Then somebody in the audience asked a question. It seemed harmless. A question people had asked for years. A question fans always wanted answered. The moderator read it from a card. If both of you were 25 years old again, the audience immediately started cheering. They already knew where this was going. The moderator smiled. Who wins? The crowd exploded. People pointed at Van Damme. Others pointed at Dolph. Some shouted, some laughed. Neither man answered immediately. Van Damme smiled. Dolph didn't. The room noticed. The moderator noticed. Van Damme noticed. Because Dolph was looking directly at him, not smiling, not joking, just watching. The audience sensed it instantly. Something had changed. The atmosphere felt different. The way a room feels different when a conversation suddenly stops being entertainment and starts becoming personal. Van Damme leaned back in his chair, still smiling, still relaxed. He looked toward Dolph, waiting. The audience waited too. 3,000 people suddenly became very interested in what Dolph Lundgren was about to say. And then Dolph reached for the microphone. The room became quiet. Not completely quiet, but quieter. The kind of quiet that appears when thousands of people realize they don't want to miss the next sentence. Dolph looked out at the audience. Then he looked back at Van Damme, and finally he spoke. You want the honest answer? The crowd cheered. Dolph nodded. The honest answer is, he paused. You wouldn't last one round. The ballroom froze. For half a second nobody reacted. Not because they hadn't heard him, because they had. Every single person in the room had heard him perfectly. The sentence hung in the air. 3,000 people trying to decide whether they had just witnessed a joke or a challenge. Van Damme stopped smiling. Not completely, just enough for people to notice. And the people who noticed suddenly leaned forward in their seats, because they knew something the rest of the audience didn't. The most interesting moments are usually the ones nobody planned. And this night had just become very interesting. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The crowd was waiting for Van Damme, because when one man tells another man in front of 3,000 people that he wouldn't survive a round, the next response matters. Van Damme picked up his microphone. The smile had returned, at least on the surface. He leaned forward slightly. "You think so?" The audience laughed nervously. Dolph nodded. "I know so." A laughter disappeared. The moderator immediately sensed danger. The kind of danger every live event host fears. Not physical danger, the other kind, the kind that takes control of the room away from the people running it. Luffner, he attempted to move on. "Well, that's certainly one opinion. Nobody cared, not anymore." The crowd wanted one thing. They wanted to know whether Dolph Lundgren truly believed what he had just said. And they wanted to know what Jean-Claude Van Damme was going to do about it. Van Damme sat quietly, looking at Dolph, not angry, not offended, studying him, the same way fighters study each other before a match begins. The moderator asked another question. Neither man answered. Not immediately, because the room's attention had already moved somewhere else. It had moved to the space between them. People felt it. 3,000 people watching two men smile at each other, while neither one seemed interested in smiling. Then Dolph spoke again, not into the microphone, directly to Van Damme, quietly enough that only the first few rows could hear, but the microphones caught part of it, and part was enough. "You've got great kicks." The audience chuckled. Dolph nodded. "They look incredible." Van Damme remained silent. But movies aren't fighting. The room erupted, half cheering, half gasping. The moderator looked like a man watching his carefully planned evening drive off a cliff. The audience loved it, because they had stopped watching a panel discussion. Now they were watching a story, and stories are far more interesting. Van Damme finally laughed, a genuine laugh, the kind that surprised people. He leaned into the microphone. "You know what's funny? You know what's funny?" The room quieted instantly. When people get very big, more laughter, they start thinking size is everything. The crowd exploded. Now it was Dolph's turn to smile. A dangerous smile. The kind that appears when somebody has decided they're finished being polite. For the next 15 minutes, the event continued. Questions were asked, answers were given, but nobody was listening anymore. The audience was waiting. Waiting for another exchange, waiting for another shot, waiting for somebody to push things one step further. Then it happened. A fan near the front stood up. The moderator reluctantly pointed toward him. The fan looked terrified and excited, which was understandable, because he was about to ask the question everyone wanted answered. "If you had the chance," the room became silent. "Would either of you actually do it?" No laughter. No applause, just silence. 3,000 people suddenly interested in the answer. Van Damme looked at Dolph. Dolph looked at Van Damme. Neither broke eye contact. Then Dolph spoke first. "Tonight." The audience roared. Van Damme laughed again. But this time there was something different in it. Something sharper. Something competitive. Dolph stood up. The room erupted. People rose from their seats. Phones appeared everywhere. Security started moving. The organizers looked horrified because this was no longer part of the schedule. Dolph took 2 steps towards center stage. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't acting angry. That somehow made it feel more serious. He pointed toward the open exhibition area beside the stage, a section of matted flooring that had been set up earlier for demonstrations. Nothing more, just a demonstration area. Until now. Dolph looked at Van Damme. Then he said the sentence that would be repeated online for years afterward. "You don't need a round." The audience leaned forward. "I'll give you 2 minutes." The building exploded. People were standing on chairs. Security was shouting into radios. Cameras pointed from every direction. The moderator had completely lost control. Van Damme slowly stood up. The noise somehow became louder. 3,000 people witnessing something they never expected to see. Not a fight, not yet, but the possibility of one. Van Damme adjusted his jacket, looked toward the crowd, then toward Dolph, and finally toward the demonstration mat. The distance between them wasn't far, maybe 30 feet. It felt like 30 miles. The crowd was no longer cheering. Now they were watching, the way people watch the opening moments of a thunderstorm. Nobody knows exactly what's coming. They only know something is. Van Damme stepped forward. One step, then another. The room became silent. Every camera followed him. Every eye followed him. Every person in the building understood the same thing. Nobody was leaving early anymore, because whatever happened next, they were going to talk about it for the rest of their lives. Dolph was already waiting on the mat, hands behind his back, completely still. The giant, the European champion, the man who believed size, pressure, and power solved most problems. Van Damme stopped several feet away. Smaller, lighter, older, but somehow looking completely comfortable. Neither man spoke. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. The crowd could feel the tension. Then Van Damme smiled. A small smile, almost invisible, and somehow that smile changed everything, because it was the smile of a man who had finally become interested. The smile of a man who had stopped treating the evening as an appearance and started treating it as a challenge. The audience felt it immediately. So did Dolph. For the first time all night, Dolph's expression changed. Only slightly. But enough, because somewhere in the back of his mind, a question had appeared. And questions are dangerous, especially for fighters, especially right before they discover whether their confidence was justified or borrowed. The crowd didn't know it yet, but the most important part of the night wasn't about to happen on the mat. It was about to happen inside Dolph Lundgren's head. The first thing people noticed was the size difference. Not because they hadn't seen it before, because standing on a stage and standing face to face are two completely different things. Dolph Lundgren looked enormous, 6'5", broad shoulders, long reach, the kind of frame that made even large men look ordinary. Van Damme looked smaller than people remembered, lean, compact, built for speed rather than intimidation. Standing together under the lights, they looked like they belonged to different weight classes. The crowd noticed, and crowds always trust what they can see. What they could see was a giant standing across from a man nearly a head shorter. The demonstration mat suddenly felt very small. Dolph stepped forward first, not aggressively, not recklessly, confidently. The confidence of a man who had spent years walking into situations expecting to be the strongest person there. The audience responded immediately. Many of them believed the same thing. Van Damme might be faster. Van Damme might be more technical. But Dolph was simply too big. Too powerful. Too much. The room had already started deciding how this story would end. The problem with stories is that they rarely ask the audience for permission before changing direction. One of the organizers stepped between them, explaining rules, explaining boundaries, explaining that this was only an exhibition. Neither man seemed interested, not because they wanted to hurt each other, because both understood something the audience didn't. The most dangerous moments don't happen when people are emotional. They happen when people become focused. And both men were focused now. The organizer stepped away. The crowd held its breath. Dolph rolled his shoulders once. Van Damme bounced lightly on the balls of his feet. The contrast was striking. Dolph looked like a tank. Van Damme looked like a blade. Then the exhibition began. The first exchange lasted less than 2 seconds. Dolph moved first. Fast, much faster than the audience expected. For a man his size, the speed was shocking. A sudden step forward, a probing kick. Nothing reckless, just enough to test distance. Van Damme wasn't there. The kick touched nothing but air. A murmur moved through the crowd. Dolph reset. Van Damme reset. Neither man looked surprised. The second exchange lasted 3 seconds. The third lasted 4. Every time Dolph advanced, every time Van Damme disappeared. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just enough. An inch, a step, half, a movement. The audience began noticing something. Dolph wasn't missing by much, but he was still missing. Again, and again, and again. 1 minute passed. No significant contact. No dramatic knockout. No flying kicks. Just movement. Observation. Adjustment. The crowd became quieter. The experienced martial artists in attendance had stopped cheering. They were watching, because they understood what casual fans did not. The fight hadn't started physically. It had started mentally. Dolph was trying to solve a problem. The problem was standing directly in front of him. Van Damme's expression hadn't changed once. He looked relaxed, almost bored, and that was beginning to irritate Dolph. Not visibly, not yet, but the signs were there. A slightly harder step, a slightly quicker entry, a little more force, a little less patience. The audience sensed it. Van Damme sensed it too, because experienced fighters notice frustration the way sailors notice changes in the wind. Long before everyone else, 90 seconds, the room had become completely silent. 3,000 people, not a sound, just eyes, watching, waiting. Dolph pressed forward again, this time committing. A sudden burst of speed, closing distance, forcing the exchange. The crowd gasped. Finally, something. Van Damme moved, not backward, sideways. The angle was tiny, almost invisible. Yet somehow Dolph found himself attacking empty space again, couldn't understand it. The martial artists could. Distance. Everything was distance. Van Damme wasn't winning with power. He wasn't winning with strength. He wasn't even winning with speed. He was winning with information. Every second that passed gave him another piece of it. How Dolph moved. How Dolph entered. How Dolph reacted. Patterns, habits, timing. The things spectators never notice. The things champions build careers around. 2 minutes. The crowd expected Van Damme to be slowing down. Instead, he looked fresher, more relaxed, more comfortable. Dolph looked dangerous. Van Damme looked certain, and certainty can be terrifying, especially when it belongs to the smaller man. The next exchange changed everything. Dolph exploded forward, the fastest movement of the night. The crowd rose from their seats, certain they were finally about to see contact. Van Damme planted his lead foot, for the first time all evening. He didn't retreat. He didn't angle away. Don't, he stayed. The audience gasped. Dolph committed. Van Damme turned. Not much, just enough. And suddenly Dolph was past him, momentum carrying him forward, balance slightly compromised. Only slightly, but enough. Van Damme touched him. One hand, one push. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent. A simple redirection. Yet Dolph stumbled 2 steps before recovering. The crowd erupted. Not because Dolph had fallen, he hadn't. Because for the first time all night, everyone saw what Van Damme had been seeing. The giant wasn't untouchable. The puzzle had an answer, and Van Damme had already found it. The applause rolled through the room. Dolph heard it. So did Van Damme. One man grew more aggressive. The other grew calmer. 3 minutes, then 4. The audience no longer cared about knockouts. They no longer cared about movie stars. What they were watching now was something else entirely. A conversation. Two fighters speaking a language most people never learn. And somewhere during that conversation, the balance of power shifted. Not dramatically, not suddenly, quietly, like a door closing. Dolph felt it first. The crowd felt it second. The realization that strength alone wasn't enough. The realization that size alone wasn't enough. The realization that Van Damme wasn't surviving the challenge. He was solving it. And once a fighter solves the puzzle in front of him, the ending usually arrives soon afterward. The audience didn't know it yet, but the moment everyone would remember for years was less than 60 seconds away. The final minute began with a silence that felt heavier than noise. Nobody was talking anymore. Nobody was filming. Even the people holding phones seemed to have forgotten why they picked them up. 3,000 people were watching, and for the first time all night, they weren't waiting for a fight. They were waiting for an answer. Dolph stood near the edge of the mat, breathing harder now. Not exhausted, but working, actually working. The realization bothered him. For most of his life, being the biggest man in the room had solved problems before they started. Pressure broke confidence. Power broke technique. Size created mistakes. That formula had worked almost everywhere. Tonight it wasn't, because the man standing across from him refused to participate in the version of the fight Dolph wanted. Van Damme wasn't trying to overpower him, wasn't trying to outmuscle him, wasn't even trying to prove anything. He was simply standing there, relaxed, watching, learning, waiting. The audience could feel it, the same way people feel a storm approaching before the clouds arrive. Something was coming. The only question was who it would belong to. Dolph stepped forward again. This time there was no hesitation, no testing, no probing, no patience. He committed. The crowd immediately sensed it. This wasn't another exchange. This wasn't another attempt to gather information. This was a decision, the decision every fighter eventually makes. If the puzzle refuses to solve itself, force it. Dolph exploded forward, faster than he had moved all night. The audience rose from their seats. Everything suddenly accelerated. 1 step, 2, 3, distance disappeared. The gap between them vanished. For the first time all evening, Dolph achieved exactly what he had been trying to achieve. He got close, very close, close enough to unleash everything. Ma! The crowd held its breath. Van Damme moved. Not backward, not sideways, forward. The reaction surprised everyone, including Dolph, especially Dolph, because fighters expect retreat. They expect resistance. They expect collision. What they rarely expect is somebody stepping directly into danger. Van Damme slipped inside the attack, inside the reach, inside the power, inside the space where Dolph expected him to be. The movement was so small, half the audience missed it. The result wasn't. Dolph suddenly found himself off balance. Not hurt, not stunned, not damaged. Off balance, just enough. The smallest mistakes become enormous when momentum is involved. And Dolph had plenty of momentum. Van Damme touched his shoulder. Nothing more. A simple redirection. The kind of movement that barely looked significant. Yet somehow the giant stumbled past him. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. The audience gasped. Dolph recovered instantly. But something important had happened. For the first time all evening, he looked surprised. Not angry, not embarrassed. Surprised. The crowd saw it. Van Damme saw it. And Dolph saw that everyone had seen it. The realization hung in the air. For years, people had debated who would have the advantage, who would be stronger, who would be faster, who would win. The answer turned out to be more complicated. Strength mattered, speed mattered, size mattered, but understanding mattered too, and understanding was beginning to take control of the evening. 45 seconds remained. The crowd knew it. The organizers knew it. Both men knew it. The exhibition was almost over, which meant whatever happened next would probably become the final memory everyone carried home. Dolph advanced again, not recklessly, not emotionally. Something had changed. The frustration was gone. The certainty was gone too. Now he was simply trying to solve the problem. The same problem Van Damme had been solving since the beginning. The crowd noticed the difference. The giant was no longer trying to dominate. He was trying to understand. And that realization changed the atmosphere entirely. The audience wasn't watching a challenge anymore. They were watching respect being built in real time. 20 seconds. Van Damme smiled. Not the smile from earlier. Not the movie star smile. A different smile. The smile of someone enjoying the conversation. The smile of someone who appreciates skill when he sees it. Dolph saw it. For a brief moment, he smiled too. Then both men moved. One final exchange, one final burst, one final answer. The crowd surged to its feet. The room exploded with noise. And then, the bell rang. The sound cut through everything. Sharp, sudden, final. The exhibition was over. For half a second, nobody reacted. 3,000 people trying to process what they had just witnessed. Then the applause began. A few people at first, then dozens, then hundreds, then everyone. The room stood, not cheering, not screaming, applauding. The kind of applause reserved for something people know they won't see again. Dolph looked at Van Damme. Van Damme looked at Dolph. Neither man moved. Then Van Damme extended his hand. Simple, direct, nothing theatrical, nothing dramatic, just respect. Dolph stared at the hand for a moment, then took it. The crowd erupted, louder than at any point during the evening. Because everybody understands respect, even people who know nothing about fighting, especially people who know nothing about fighting. The two men stood together at the center of the mat while flashes exploded throughout the room. Thousands of people trying to capture a moment that had already become a story. Van Damme leaned forward, said something quietly. Only Dolph heard it. Nobody else. Not the audience. Not the organizers. Not the cameras. Years later, people would speculate endlessly about what had been said. Nobody ever knew for sure. The mystery only made the story bigger. Dolph nodded once. Van Damme nodded back. Then they turned toward the crowd. 3,000 people rose to their feet again, applauding, whistling, celebrating. Not because someone had won, because both men had. The giant who learned something, and the veteran who had nothing left to prove. The audience would spend years arguing about who looked better, who had the advantage, who controlled the exchanges. Those arguments would never end. But everyone in that room agreed on one thing. The most memorable moment wasn't a strike, wasn't a takedown, wasn't a challenge. It was the realization that greatness recognizes greatness, and that sometimes the strongest man in the room isn't the one who overpowers everyone else. Sometimes it's the one who remains calm while everyone else is trying to prove something. The crowd slowly began leaving. Conversations filling the hallways. Stories already changing shape. Details already growing larger. Exactly the way great stories always do. Years later, most people wouldn't remember the questions, wouldn't remember the moderator, wouldn't remember the schedule. They would remember one sentence. You won't last one round. And they would remember what happened after it. Because challenges create attention, but respect creates legends. And that night, in front of 3,000 people, both men walked away as legends. The strange thing about legendary moments is that they rarely feel legendary while they're happening. Most people don't realize they're witnessing something memorable until much later. That night was no different. The crowd eventually left. The lights were switched off. The chairs were folded. The banners came down. Workers rolled up the mats. By midnight, the convention center looked exactly the same as it had the day before, as though nothing unusual had happened. But something had, because stories do not live inside buildings. Stories live inside people. And 3,000 people had just walked out carrying the same story. By sunrise the next morning, the story was already spreading. People told it differently. Some made Dolph look bigger. Others made Van Damme look faster. Some claimed there had been hundreds of exchanges. Others swore there had only been a handful. The details shifted. The facts stretched. The memories evolved. They always do. What remained constant was the feeling. Everyone who had been there described the same thing. The tension, the challenge, the silence, the respect. That part never changed. The story traveled through martial arts schools, through gyms, through conventions, through movie sets, through phone calls, then through the internet. Every year it grew. Every year new people discovered it. Every year the debate started again. Who had looked better? Who controlled the exchanges? Who really won? The arguments never stopped. And maybe that was the reason the story survived. Because unresolved stories tend to live longer than resolved ones. Years passed, then more years. The world changed. Action movies changed. Martial arts changed. Audiences changed. But one thing remained surprisingly consistent. Both men continued earning respect. Van Damme continued doing what Van Damme had always done. He kept reinventing himself. The public saw the movies, the premieres, the headlines, the interviews. What most people didn't see was the work, the endless training, the injuries, the setbacks, the pressure, the reality behind the image. Because maintaining a reputation is often harder than building one. The world sees success. The person living it sees responsibility. Meanwhile, Dolph followed a different path. The giant who had once relied on size and power became something more. His career expanded. His perspective expanded. His understanding expanded. Age does that to people. The older you become, the more complicated the world appears. The certainties of youth begin to disappear, and that's usually a good thing, because certainty is comfortable. Growth is not. Years later, a reporter asked Dolph a question during an interview, not about movies, not about fame, not about Hollywood, about martial arts. The reporter asked whether there had ever been a moment when another fighter surprised him. Dolph smiled, not immediately, not dramatically, just enough for the people who knew him to notice. Then he gave an answer, a short answer, the kind older men tend to give. The kind that says more than it appears to. He said, "The people who impress you the most are usually the people trying the least to impress you." Then he changed the subject. The interviewer moved on. Most viewers never thought about the answer again. Some did, because hidden inside that sentence was an observation that takes many people decades to learn. Real confidence is usually quiet. The people who have the most to prove are often the loudest. The people who have the least to prove rarely need to convince anyone of anything. That lesson appears everywhere. In sports, in business, in relationships, in life. The strongest person isn't always the loudest person. The smartest person isn't always the one speaking the most. The most dangerous person in a room is often the one paying attention while everyone else is talking. The older both men became, the more obvious that lesson appeared. The public continued comparing them. Van Damme versus Dolph. Speed versus power. Technique versus size. Movie star versus giant. But the comparison missed the point, because the story had never really been about who was better. It had been about what happened when confidence met experience, when certainty met patience, when strength met understanding. The audience thought they were watching two fighters. What they were actually watching was two philosophies. One philosophy believed the answer could be imposed. The other believed the answer could be discovered. One philosophy tried to force the moment. The other waited for it. And eventually the moment chose its side. That is why the story survived. Not because of who threw what. Not because of who moved where. Not because of who landed anything. The story survived because everyone recognized themselves in it. At some point in life, everyone becomes Dolph, certain, confident, convinced they understand exactly what is about to happen. Then reality introduces a variable they didn't account for, a person, a challenge, a setback, a lesson, something that refuses to behave the way they expected. and suddenly confidence is replaced by curiosity. The smartest people make that transition quickly. The rest fight it. Eventually, life wins anyway. That is why older audiences love stories like this. Because they stop seeing fighters. They start seeing themselves. The young man trying to prove something. The older man who already has. The challenge, the lesson, the growth, the respect. Every generation experiences some version of it. That night simply gave people a visual representation of the idea. 2 men, 1 mat, 3,000 witnesses, and a lesson nobody expected. Years later, if you asked the people who had been there what they remembered most, many of them would struggle to recall specific details. Memory works that way. Specifics fade, meaning remains. Most would remember the challenge. Most would remember the silence. Most would remember the handshake. But what they really remembered was the feeling. The feeling of watching 2 men discover that respect is more valuable than victory. And perhaps that was always the real ending. Not a winner, not a loser, not a knockout, not a humiliation. A realization. The realization that greatness does not need validation. It only needs recognition. And on that night, in front of 3,000 people, 2 legends recognized it in each other. The audience applauded. The lights went out. The doors closed. The years passed. But the story remained, because some stories are remembered for what happened, and some stories are remembered for what they teach. This one managed to do both, and that is why people are still talking about it today.